March 17th, 1944. Sicherheitsdienst, Regional Headquarters, Vichy. Sturmbannführer Klaus Barbie sat across from Obersturmbannführer Werner Knapp in a smoke-filled briefing room, reviewing the latest intelligence reports from occupied Auvergne. Recent weeks had seen escalating resistance activity, severed communication lines, ambushed supply convoys, weapons caches disappearing from rail yards. Nab tapped a folder, marked with the code name they'd assigned their most elusive target. "This white mouse," he said, the contempt evident in his voice. 5 million francs, and we chase shadows cast by a woman playing spy games. Barbie lit a cigarette and leaned back, laughing. "Our informants confirm she's organizing scattered farmer groups. Amateur resistance theater. Women excel at carrying messages and looking decorative at checkpoints, nothing more." Around the table, other officers joined the assessment. A woman leading military operations was absurd on its face. Female agents made useful couriers precisely because no one suspected them of strategic importance. The consensus was unanimous. This white mouse represented an intelligence nuisance, certainly worth capturing for what she knew about Allied networks, but operationally irrelevant. Nab raised his glass. "To the mouse who thinks she's a lion." What Barbie didn't know was that at that exact moment, Nancy Wake was conducting final preparations for an operation that would demolish his entire assessment. The 31-year-old Australian journalist turned SOE agent had parachuted into France 2 weeks earlier and was already coordinating weapons distribution across multiple Maquis cells. She had recruited 127 new fighters in the previous 10 days alone, building toward the force of 7,000 that would eventually make her the most effective resistance coordinator in France. Born in Wellington and raised in Sydney, Wake had witnessed Nazi brutality firsthand in Vienna in 1933 and vowed to fight it. Now she commanded more armed resistance fighters than many regular army colonels led conventional soldiers. She had survived Gestapo interrogation in Toulouse, escaped over the Pyrenees in freezing conditions, and returned to France, knowing the Germans had tortured and executed her husband Henri for refusing to reveal her location. Within 48 hours of that meeting in Vichy, Wake's fighters would destroy 2 ammunition depots and a fuel storage facility Barbie's forces had been using to supply operations against partisan groups. The explosions would light the night sky visible for 15 kilometers. German counterinsurgency doctrine, perfected through brutal experience in Poland, Yugoslavia, and the Soviet Union since 1939, rested on principles that had proven devastatingly effective. Each requirement emerged from specific operational failures and subsequent corpse counts. After partisan attacks killed 1,947 Wehrmacht soldiers in Yugoslavia in 1941, German command mandated extensive informant networks in every occupied village, paying cash bounties for intelligence and implementing collective punishment protocols that executed 10 civilians for every German soldier killed. When sabotage operations in Poland succeeded due to poor coordination between security services, the Reich established unified command structures, placing Gestapo, SD, and Wehrmacht security divisions under single operational control. After partisans in the Soviet Union exploited gaps in German coverage by operating from remote forests, doctrine required mobile rapid reaction forces capable of surrounding resistance strongholds within hours. The Einsatzgruppen model provided the template, professional soldiers and security personnel who understood that controlling occupied territory meant eliminating resistance infrastructure through systematic identification and destruction of leadership, supply networks, and popular support. These weren't theoretical principles. They were conclusions written in blood, refined through trial and error, across 3 years of occupation. By 1944, German counterinsurgency had achieved kill ratios exceeding 10 partisans for every German casualty in most occupied territories. The system worked. While German officers perfected those requirements through mass executions and torture, Nancy Wake was proving them fundamentally irrelevant to her style of warfare. On March 23, 1944, she coordinated her largest operations yet, directing simultaneous attacks on 3 separate German installations across a 70-kilometer front. The operation violated every principal German doctrine considered essential. She had no unified command structure, just loose coordination between independent Maquis groups who distrusted each other's politics. She possessed no systematic informant network, relying instead on farmers and shopkeepers who passed information through personal relationships the Gestapo couldn't penetrate. Her fighters weren't professional soldiers, but farmers, mechanics, teachers, and students who melted back into civilian life after each operation. She commanded through earned respect and demonstrated competence rather than military hierarchy. The raid succeeded spectacularly. 17 tons of ammunition destroyed, 4 vehicles disabled, and Wake's forces withdrew before German rapid reaction teams even mobilized. This was Operation 43 in what would eventually total hundreds of sabotage actions coordinated across her network of 7,000 fighters. German response reports classified the attacks as bandit activity committed by terrorist elements, completely missing that a single woman was orchestrating operations across an entire department. Their doctrine assumed resistance required the kind of hierarchical structure they could infiltrate and decapitate. Wake's approach made hierarchy itself a vulnerability to avoid. The Soviet or British response violated every principle German counterinsurgency doctrine established. Where German security apparatus deployed the Gestapo's 32,000 trained investigators, extensive torture facilities in every major city, and informant networks paying millions of Reichsmarks annually for intelligence, the Special Operations Executive sent individual agents with false papers, cyanide pills, and instructions to avoid capture at all costs. The contrast was staggering. Gestapo interrogators had developed torture techniques refined over a decade, maintained detailed files on hundreds of thousands of suspected resistance members, and could cross-reference intelligence across occupied Europe through centralized databases in Berlin. Average life expectancy for SOE agents in France was 6 weeks before capture. Survival required operating in conditions that would have been considered suicidal by conventional military standards. SOE provided minimal equipment, no backup, no extraction guarantees, no official status under Geneva Conventions. Captured agents could expect torture, followed by execution, their deaths unacknowledged, their bodies unmarked. The Germans calculated a 15-to-1 advantage in resources, training, and infrastructure over any individual resistance network. What German security services saw as decisive advantages, Nancy Wake transformed into fatal vulnerabilities they never anticipated. On April 8, 1944, she exploited the very centralization that made German intelligence so formidable. Gestapo headquarters in Montluçon maintained files on every suspected resistance member in the region, making it an irreplaceable intelligence hub. Wake planned a raid that would destroy not just the building, but the entire regional intelligence archive. During the operation, an SS sentry spotted movement near the rear entrance. He reached for his whistle to sound the alarm. Wake moved with the precise economy of motion her SOE instructors had drilled into her, the judo chop technique she'd practiced on sandbags at the Scottish training facility. The strike crushed his trachea instantly, killing him silently before he could alert the guards inside. The raid destroyed the headquarters and killed 38 German personnel. More importantly, it incinerated thousands of intelligence files the Gestapo had compiled over 18 months. Her forces had eliminated the central nervous system of German counterinsurgency operations in one night. She later described it, without emotion, as a tactical necessity, the kind of close combat work that came with the job. This operation brought her count of coordinated actions to 67, steadily building toward the massive network of 7,000 resistance fighters she would command by June. An official Sicherheitsdienst assessment from April 15, 1944, analyzed the resistance threat in occupied France with the methodical precision German intelligence was famous for. The document, marked Geheim and distributed to regional SD commanders, concluded that deployment of female operatives by Allied intelligence services represented fundamentally flawed strategy, driven by personnel shortages rather than tactical innovation. British Special Operations Executive demonstrated desperation by recruiting women for roles requiring physical stamina, combat leadership, and operational decision-making under extreme stress, capabilities female agents inherently lacked, regardless of training. Historical precedent provided no examples of women successfully commanding military forces larger than small courier networks. Physiological limitations meant female agents could not sustain the physical demands of coordinated partisan warfare. Psychological assessments indicated women would prove more susceptible to interrogation pressure and more likely to compromise operational security when faced with torture. The mathematics were straightforward. German security forces maintained overwhelming advantages in manpower: 140,000 Wehrmacht Security Division personnel and 32,000 Gestapo investigators versus perhaps 15,000 poorly equipped partisans across all of France. Equipment disparities were even more pronounced. German forces possessed armored vehicles, artillery, air support, and professional military training, while resistance groups operated with civilian hunting rifles and improvised explosives. The assessment predicted female SOE agents would achieve temporary propaganda value through their novelty, but would prove operationally ineffective within months. Recommendation: monitor for intelligence purposes, but do not allocate disproportionate resources to pursuit given limited operational threat. This assessment carried the full authority of Reichssicherheitshauptamt and represented the consensus of Germany's premier counterinsurgency experts. It was catastrophically wrong. While German High Command calculated female operatives as negligible threats, Nancy Wake was systematically destroying the infrastructure their entire southern France logistics network depended on. Between April 20th and April 28th, her coordinated operations cut the main rail line between Vichy and Lyon in 17 separate locations, demolished a fuel depot containing 80,000 liters of diesel, and ambushed 3 supply convoys carrying munitions to German positions preparing for the anticipated Allied invasion. The attacks displayed tactical sophistication that contradicted every assumption in the SD assessment. She had established dead drops for weapons distribution that operated for weeks without German detection, coordinated timing across groups operating 70 kilometers apart with no radio communication, and developed supply chains that moved Allied weapons from drop zones to fighters faster than German intelligence could track. By this period, she had recruited and organized over 2,000 of the eventual 7,000 fighters, who would operate under her coordination, building the largest single resistance network in the Auvergne region. German logistics officers recorded unexplainable losses of materiel that didn't correlate with known partisan activity patterns. They were searching for networks of male commanders leading organized military-style units. Wake operated through distributed cells of civilians who gathered for specific operations and dissolved back into normal life. A model German doctrine hadn't anticipated because it didn't match their assumptions about how military operations had to be structured. Every weapons cache the Germans discovered led them to conclude they were facing dozens of separate resistance groups, rather than one woman coordinating operations across the entire region. The Germans had made a fatal calculation error that would cost them operational control of central France. Their strategic logic seemed unassailable. German security forces deployed professional soldiers with military training, established chain of command, and overwhelming material advantages against amateur resistance fighters with minimal equipment and no formal military structure. Wehrmacht security divisions could mobilize battalion-strength forces with armor and artillery support within hours to crush any partisan concentration. The mathematics of force multiplication favored professional military organization, proven through centuries of conventional warfare, where disciplined armies with clear command hierarchies defeated irregular forces. What German planners critically overlooked was that their entire counterinsurgency model assumed resistance would fight the kind of war German forces were structured to win. They prepared to crush organized partisan armies that concentrated forces, held territory, and engaged in sustained combat. Wake never gave them that fight. She understood the fundamental asymmetry. German forces needed to find and fix resistance fighters to destroy them, but resistance fighters only needed to strike and disperse faster than Germans could respond. The Gestapo built elaborate intelligence networks to infiltrate resistance command structures. But Wake's leadership model made traditional infiltration impossible because she commanded through relationships rather than formal hierarchy. German rapid reaction forces were optimized to encircle and annihilate partisan strongholds, but her fighters never established strongholds to encircle. On May 11, 1944, Wake demonstrated how thoroughly she understood this paradox. German forces had tracked weapons movements to the village of Chaudes Egg and deployed 2 companies of security troops, over 400 men with armored cars and machine guns, expecting to catch a major resistance cell. Wake had anticipated the German response. By the time Wehrmacht forces surrounded the village, her fighters had already dispersed the weapons to 17 different locations and withdrawn. The Germans occupied an empty village, searched every building, interrogated civilians, and found nothing. Meanwhile, that same night, Wake coordinated attacks on 2 separate German checkpoints 40 kilometers away, killing 7 soldiers and capturing their weapons before withdrawing into countryside the German Rapid Reaction Force couldn't reach in time. The operation illustrated the complete inversion of conventional military advantage. German professional military structure made them predictable. Their doctrine required certain responses to partisan activity, which Wake exploited ruthlessly. Their superior firepower was useless if they couldn't concentrate it against targets that refused to remain stationary. This tactical approach, refined across hundreds of operations and implemented through the network of 7,000 resistance fighters she coordinated, made her the single most effective Allied operative in southern France, measured by enemy casualties inflicted per capita. German commanders calculated firepower, mobility, training, and discipline. They calculated everything, except one variable. You cannot destroy an enemy who refuses to fight the battle you're prepared to win. And Nancy Wake never fought the battles Germans expected. The asymmetry that had already enabled Nancy Wake to evade Klaus Barbie's entire security apparatus was only the first of 3 fundamental advantages she possessed over German counterinsurgency forces. While Wehrmacht strategists assumed female operatives represented desperate Allied improvisation, Wake was exploiting structural vulnerabilities in German occupation doctrine that male agents couldn't access as effectively. The advantage wasn't physical capability, but strategic invisibility. German security protocols, refined through years of occupation across Europe, were optimized to detect and destroy organized military resistance. Every checkpoint procedure, every interrogation technique, every informant network was designed to identify male partisans moving weapons, coordinating attacks, and operating command structures. The Gestapo trained officers to recognize specific behavioral patterns: nervous men traveling alone, groups of military-age males gathering, individuals with calloused hands inconsistent with stated occupations. Their entire detection system assumed resistance leaders would look and behave like soldiers attempting to disguise themselves as civilians. Wake didn't fit that profile because she genuinely wasn't disguising anything. She was exactly what she appeared to be, a well-dressed woman traveling on legitimate business. On May 3rd, 1944, during Operation 78 of the Hundred, she would coordinate across her network of 7,000 fighters. Wake demonstrated this advantage with precision that made German security protocols worthless. She needed to transport 50,000 francs and coded messages to 3 separate Meki cells operating 60 kilometers apart. The route required passing through 4 German checkpoints, each staffed with soldiers trained to detect contraband and identify resistance couriers. Wake dressed immaculately, applied makeup carefully, and carried the money in her handbag, alongside lipstick and a compact mirror. At the first checkpoint, a young Wehrmacht soldier asked to see her papers. She smiled, asked if he was from Bavaria based on his accent, and mentioned she'd visited Munich before the war. He checked her documents perfunctorily and waved her through. At the second checkpoint, she flirted mildly with an older sergeant, letting him light her cigarette and complaining about fuel rationing making travel so difficult. He searched her bag, saw cosmetics and personal items, and returned it without finding the money, hidden in a false bottom she'd sewn herself. The third checkpoint involved a more thorough inspection by an SS officer who seemed suspicious of her stated reason for travel. Wake maintained perfect composure, met his eyes directly, and explained she was visiting a sick aunt with the kind of aristocratic confidence that suggested she was accustomed to deference. The officer, unconsciously influenced by her gender and presentation, accepted the explanation. At the fourth checkpoint, she simply smiled and asked the guards if they wanted to search her, using the same technique she'd employed dozens of times. They laughed and waved her through, never imagining that this beautiful woman coordinating her appearance so carefully was the white mouse worth 5 million francs. By evening, she delivered all messages and coordinated simultaneous attacks that would destroy 2 German supply depots the following night. This single day's work, replicated across dozens of similar operations as she built her network towards 7,000 fighters, proved that German checkpoint procedures were fundamentally blind to the threat she represented. The second advantage emerged from what German counterinsurgency doctrine considered a decisive strength, but was actually a critical vulnerability. The Gestapo and SD operated through centralized command structures that concentrated intelligence, coordinated operations across regions, and maintained detailed records enabling them to track resistance networks systematically. Every captured resistance member was interrogated at regional headquarters, information was compiled into files cross-referenced with other intelligence, and operations were planned by professional security officers with access to comprehensive data. This centralization made German counterinsurgency formidable against conventional resistance networks that required similar hierarchical organization to function. But Wake's operational model inverted the entire structure. She commanded through personal relationships rather than military hierarchy, coordinated through face-to-face meetings rather than written orders, and maintained operational security by ensuring each Maquis cell operated independently with limited knowledge of other cells. The Gestapo built extensive networks to infiltrate resistance command structures, but Wake's leadership model made traditional infiltration nearly impossible because there was no formal command structure to infiltrate. An informant embedded in one Maquis group could compromise that group, but couldn't identify the broader network because individual fighters didn't know the broader network existed. Wake herself was the only person who understood the complete operational picture, and that knowledge existed entirely in her memory rather than in documents the Gestapo could capture. During the critical period from May 15th to May 28th, 1944, Wake demonstrated how thoroughly this decentralized model frustrated German intelligence efforts. The Gestapo had infiltrated a Maquis group near Aurillac and arrested 17 resistance fighters, a success that normally would have enabled them to roll up an entire network through systematic interrogation. German interrogators extracted information about planned sabotage operations, weapons cache locations, and the names of other resistance members in that specific cell. They compiled this intelligence, cross-referenced it with existing files, and prepared operations to destroy what they assumed was a significant resistance network. What they discovered instead was that the captured fighters knew nothing beyond their immediate cell. They couldn't identify resistance leadership because Wake coordinated through intermediaries and changed her appearance regularly. They couldn't reveal weapons distribution networks because each cell received weapons through separate channels. They couldn't compromise other operations because Wake compartmentalized planning so thoroughly that one group's capture didn't affect others. While the Gestapo congratulated themselves on dismantling a resistance cell, Wake was simultaneously coordinating operations by 12 other independent groups the Germans didn't know existed. On May 27th, while German security forces were still processing intelligence from the Aurillac arrests, Wake coordinated simultaneous attacks on 5 separate German installations across a 90-kilometer radius. The operations destroyed ammunition stores, disabled vehicles, and cut communication lines. German intelligence reports couldn't connect these attacks to each other or to the network they'd supposedly dismantled because the Gestapo's entire analytical framework assumed centralized resistance command. By this point, Wake was coordinating operations across an estimated 3,400 fighters, approaching half of the eventual 7,000 who would operate under her network, and German intelligence still hadn't identified her as a single coordinator, rather than multiple separate resistance cells operating independently. But the third advantage proved most devastating to German operational effectiveness and to the morale of occupation forces who couldn't understand why their superior resources were failing. The advantage was local knowledge exploited through integration rather than occupation. German security forces operated as occupiers in hostile territory where they couldn't trust local populations, couldn't distinguish civilians from partisans, and couldn't navigate countryside without exposing themselves to ambush. Wehrmacht's security doctrine addressed this vulnerability by concentrating forces in fortified positions, conducting large-scale sweep operations with overwhelming force, and punishing civilian populations collectively to deter partisan support. This approach worked against conventional partisan armies that attempted to hold territory or mass forces for sustained combat. Wake never provided that target. She understood every village, every forest path, every barn where weapons could be hidden, every farmer who would provide false information to German patrols. Her fighters melted into local populations where German forces couldn't follow without exposing themselves to precisely the kind of ambush they feared. More critically, the local population actively supported her network because she'd proven herself trustworthy and effective, while German collective punishment policies guaranteed civilian populations would support any resistance that fought back. On June 11, 1944, 5 days after D-Day landings had begun in Normandy, Wake orchestrated an operation that demonstrated this local integration advantage with devastating effectiveness. German forces in the Auvergne region had received orders to suppress all resistance as activity to prevent partisan attacks on Wehrmacht units potentially redeploying to counter the Allied invasion. A security battalion of 800 soldiers was tasked with sweeping the countryside around Chaudes Egg to locate and destroy Maquis forces. Wake received intelligence about the planned operation 48 hours before it began, because local villagers who worked as translators at German headquarters quietly passed information to trusted contacts. She organized a response that would have been impossible for any occupying force to execute. She positioned small groups of her fighters along every route the German battalion could take, using local knowledge of terrain to identify ambush positions the Germans couldn't avoid if they wanted to reach their objective. She arranged for farmers to provide false information about Maquis positions, directing German forces toward empty forests while her actual fighters established positions elsewhere. She coordinated timing so precisely that when the German sweep began, her network struck 17 separate targets across the region, simultaneously, none of which German forces could reach because they'd already committed to the sweep operation. The Germans spent 2 days searching countryside for resistance fighters who were attacking their supply lines 70 kilometers away. When the security battalion finally returned, exhausted and having found nothing, they discovered Wake's forces had destroyed fuel depots, ambushed supply convoys, and cut communication lines to 3 different German installations. The operation expanded her reputation among local resistance groups and enabled her to recruit an additional 400 fighters in the following 2 weeks, bringing her total coordinated force past 4,500 as she continued building toward the peak strength of 7,000 that would make her network the most effective resistance organization in central France. A captured German report from June 15th noted with frustration that partisan forces seem to possess supernatural intelligence about our movements and intentions, completely missing that Wake's advantage came from people the Germans encountered every day but never suspected of resistance coordination. German technical superiority in counterinsurgency capabilities meant nothing in operational reality when facing Wake's resistance model. The Gestapo's impressive organizational structure included 32,000 trained investigators, sophisticated interrogation facilities in every major city, extensive filing systems, cross-referencing intelligence across occupied Europe, and formal cooperation agreements with Wehrmacht security divisions enabling coordinated operations. The bureaucratic sophistication was staggering. Gestapo headquarters in Lyon maintained detailed files on over 50,000 suspected resistance members and sympathizers, could cross-reference arrests with intelligence from Paris, Berlin, and Vienna within days, and coordinated security operations across southern France through regular staff meetings attended by senior SD and Wehrmacht officers. Operational tempo for major counterinsurgency operations was methodical and thorough. Planning a sweep operation required 3 to 5 days for intelligence analysis, force coordination, and logistics preparation. Execution involved hundreds of soldiers, armored vehicles, and air support when available. Average Gestapo regional operation required approximately 40 personnel and consumed substantial resources in transportation, communications, and documentation. Success rates were respectable when facing conventional resistance networks. The Gestapo's systematic approach had destroyed numerous resistance cells across France, captured hundreds of resistance fighters, and severely disrupted Allied intelligence networks. Contrast with Wake's operational reality revealed the paradox German counterinsurgency planners never anticipated. Her organizational structure consisted of herself, 2 radio operators who coordinated with London for weapons drops, and a network of trusted intermediaries who connected her to independent Maquis cells. Cost and logistics were minimal. SOE had invested approximately £15,000 in her training, equipment, and insertion into France. Ongoing operational costs were negligible, just the expense of weapons and supplies parachuted from Britain, plus modest payments to resistance fighters. Operational tempo was rapid and flexible. Wake could plan and execute an operation in hours rather than days because she didn't require formal approvals, didn't coordinate through bureaucratic channels, and made tactical decisions based on immediate intelligence rather than comprehensive analysis. Maintenance between operations was non-existent. There were no reports to file, no formal debriefings with superiors, no bureaucratic procedures slowing operational cycles. Coordination challenges were minimal because she worked with people she knew personally and trusted implicitly. Average effectiveness per operation was extraordinary. While Gestapo's sweep operations that consumed massive resources often found nothing, Wake's small-scale coordinated attacks consistently destroyed valuable German materiel and killed enemy personnel. Survival rate for her network approached 95%, catastrophically higher than German security forces achieved when facing organized military opposition. The paradox became undeniable. More expensive, sophisticated security apparatus produced lower operational effectiveness. Simpler, cheaper resistance organization achieved higher operational effectiveness. German advantages in technology, bureaucracy, and resources had become disadvantages in operational efficiency. These statistics were embodied in Wake's operational record during the crucial weeks before and after D-Day. Between May 20th and June 30th, 1944, she coordinated an average of 14 separate operations per week, ranging from small ambushes involving 10 fighters to major coordinated attacks, engaging 200 resistance members simultaneously. Ground coordination efficiency was remarkable. She could plan an operation in the morning, communicate instructions to cell leaders by afternoon, and execute the attack that evening while German forces were still processing intelligence from operations 3 days earlier. Total material destroyed during this 6-week period included an estimated 40 tons of ammunition, 63 military vehicles, 7 fuel depots, and infrastructure damage that disrupted German logistics across the entire Auvergne region. German casualties from operations she coordinated exceeded 300 killed or wounded. Personnel losses from her network during the same period totaled 11 fighters killed and 23 captured, a casualty rate that would have been considered impossible by conventional military standards. She never paused operations for more than 2 consecutive days during this entire period, maintaining operational tempo that German security forces couldn't match despite vastly superior resources. By late June, her network had expanded to approximately 6,200 fighters, approaching the peak strength of 7,000 that represented more armed resistance personnel than many Wehrmacht regiments fielded in conventional forces. Compare this to German security operations, where the most accomplished Gestapo regional office might conduct 4 major operations per month. Wake was coordinating 50 operations monthly with a fraction of German resources and achieving dramatically higher success rates. Her network of 7,000 fighters was becoming legendary, even among German soldiers who were beginning to understand they faced an opponent whose operational model their entire security apparatus wasn't designed to counter. Wehrmacht logistics officers were recording a disturbing pattern in requisition and loss reports that contradicted everything German counterinsurgency doctrine predicted about resource efficiency. German expenditure attempting to suppress resistance activity in the Auvergne region alone was staggering. Security operations consumed military resources at rates that shocked planners accustomed to efficient logistics. Personnel costs included the equivalent of 2,000 soldiers assigned exclusively into counterinsurgency duties in areas where Wake's network operated, representing monthly personnel costs exceeding 800,000 Reichsmarks in salaries, equipment, and support infrastructure. Vehicle losses to partisan ambushes required constant replacement, with procurement costs for destroyed trucks and cars reaching 5 million Reichsmarks between April and July 1944. Ammunition expenditure was extraordinary. German forces fired an estimated 3 million rounds, attempting to suppress partisan attacks during this period, at standard procurement costs of 2 Reichsmarks per rifle round, totaling 6 million Reichsmarks just for small arms ammunition. Operations required fuel for vehicles, supplies for soldiers, communications equipment for coordination, and administrative overhead for planning and documentation. Collective punishment operations, burning villages suspected of harboring resistance fighters and executing civilians, consumed additional resources while generating more resistance recruitment than they prevented. Intelligence operations attempting to infiltrate resistance networks cost hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks in informant payments, surveillance operations, and interrogation facility maintenance. Total. German investment in attempting to suppress resistance activity in Wake's operational area exceeded 30 million Reichsmarks during the 3 months before and after D-Day, approximately $12 million in contemporary currency. Soviet investment in comparable operations was a fraction of that amount, but Wake's situation demonstrated even more dramatic asymmetry. British SOE investment in her specifically included approximately £15,000 for training, £5,000 for equipment and insertion, and ongoing costs of roughly £2,000 monthly for weapons drops and supply provision to her network. Total British investment in Wake's operations from her April 1944 insertion through July totaled approximately £23,000, equivalent to roughly $92,000. She coordinated a network of 7,000 fighters who received minimal payment, operated with captured German weapons supplemented by Allied drops, and sustained themselves through local support rather than formal logistics chains. Cost ratio revealed perfect asymmetric warfare. Germans were spending approximately 100 to 1 trying to stop what the British had spent creating. Effectiveness comparison made the disparity even more striking. German security forces achieved minimal success despite massive resource investment, capturing or killing approximately 200 resistance fighters during the period at a cost exceeding 150,000 Reichsmarks per resistance casualty. Wake's network inflicted over 400 German casualties during the same period at a cost of approximately $230 per German killed or wounded when calculated against British investment. Result demonstrated what Wehrmacht logistics officers were beginning to understand with growing alarm. Suppressing partisan resistance cost more than the partisans' cost to create and sustain, and the disparity was getting worse rather than better as resistance networks expanded. Nancy Wake personally represented this asymmetric efficiency with mathematical precision that must have appalled German accountants who eventually reviewed operational costs. Conservative estimates suggested German security forces had expended over 2 million Reichsmarks, specifically attempting to capture or kill her between her first courier operations in 1940 and mid-1944. This calculation included the 5 million franc bounty offered for information leading to her capture, equivalent to 625,000 Reichsmarks, plus operational costs for surveillance operations, interrogations of suspected associates, checkpoint procedures enhanced specifically to detect her, and Gestapo investigator time allocated to tracking her movements. Additional costs included the failed interrogation in Toulouse in 1943, multiple sweep operations in areas where informants reported her presence, and enhanced security protocols at German installations after her network's attacks. If German forces allocated even modest resources attempting to intercept her during each of the hundreds of operations she coordinated, total expenditure easily exceeded 3 million Reichsmarks spent attempting to stop one woman. Result: she not only survived, but expanded operations. Her coordinated attacks destroyed German materiel valued at over 10 million Reichsmarks based on standard Wehrmacht procurement costs for ammunition, vehicles, fuel, and infrastructure. Value comparison revealed she had destroyed more than triple what Germans spent trying to kill her. Personnel impact was even more dramatic. Her network of 7,000 fighters represented more combat effectiveness than entire German security divisions. Average USAAF bomber crew rotated home after 25 missions. Wake had coordinated hundreds of operations by mid-1944, equivalent to more than 20 complete American combat tours. She represented more operational impact than multiple squadrons of conventional forces while consuming a fraction of the resources. Her network of 7,000 fighters was, by any rational cost-benefit analysis, one of the most efficient military investments the Allies made in France during the entire war. German High Command was beginning to realize that suppressing female resistance coordinators operating decentralized networks was costing exponentially more than those coordinators were costing the Allies. And Nancy Wake, approaching the peak strength of 7,000 fighters under her coordination, had no intention of stopping. As German High Command grappled with the mounting resource drain from resistance operations in central France, intelligence officers in Lyon were assembling a file that would fundamentally challenge their understanding of the partisan threat. Throughout May and early June 1944, Gestapo interrogators had extracted fragments of information from captured resistance fighters that didn't fit expected patterns. Prisoners referred to coordination beyond individual cells. They mentioned weapons distributions too sophisticated for amateur partisans. They described operations planned with military precision unusual for civilian resistance groups. Most puzzling, several prisoners, under interrogation, mentioned receiving orders from someone they called Helene, but couldn't or wouldn't provide physical descriptions beyond vague references to authority and competence. Gestapo analysts assumed Helene was a code name for multiple coordinators or a propaganda invention to confuse German intelligence. Then, on June 8, 1944, 2 days after Allied forces landed at Normandy, a Maquis courier was captured near Montluçon, carrying documents he hadn't managed to destroy. The papers included operational orders signed Hélène, weapons distribution schedules, and a list of target coordinates for sabotage operations planned across the following week. More critically, the documents referenced coordination with London and mentioned payment schedules for what the papers described as approximately 7,000 fighters across regional networks. The Gestapo officer who reviewed the documents initially dismissed the figure as obvious exaggeration. No resistance network in France commanded forces approaching that scale. The largest known Maquis groups numbered hundreds, perhaps 1,000 at absolute maximum. 7,000 fighters would represent a military force equivalent to a Wehrmacht division. But cross-referencing the captured documents with existing intelligence files revealed a disturbing pattern. Attack dates mentioned in the papers corresponded exactly with recent sabotage operations. Target locations matched German installations that had been hit in the previous 2 weeks. Weapons quantities referenced in distribution schedules aligned with Allied drops Luftwaffe reconnaissance had detected. The financial figures were too precise and detailed to be fabrication. An emergency intelligence assessment convened June 12th brought together Gestapo regional commanders, SD analysts, and Wehrmacht security officers. The briefing officer, Sturmbannführer Ernst Hoffmann, presented findings that met immediate skepticism. Multiple independent intelligence sources suggested the White Mouse, the elusive courier worth 5 million francs who had evaded capture since 1940, had returned to France and was now coordinating partisan operations on unprecedented scale. Captured documents, prisoner testimonies, and operational pattern analysis all pointed to a single coordinator operating under the code name Hélène, managing what appeared to be the largest resistance network in central France. Hoffmann's most controversial conclusion: evidence suggested this coordinator was the same person the Gestapo had failed to capture in 1943, the woman they'd nicknamed the White Mouse. Officers around the table demanded verification. The notion that a single female operative could organize 7,000 fighters violated every assumption about women's capabilities in military contexts and about how resistance networks functioned. Wehrmacht intelligence was tasked with urgent verification. Within 5 days, interrogation of newly captured prisoners, analysis of intercepted radio traffic, and reports from informants confirmed the assessment. The White Mouse had transformed from courier to military coordinator. Nancy Wake, identified through cross-referencing with pre-1943 Gestapo files, was leading the most effective resistance organization Germany faced in southern France. The revelation created immediate crisis within Wehrmacht command structure that went far beyond tactical concerns. For senior officers whose entire worldview rested on assumptions about natural hierarchies and appropriate roles, the confirmation that a woman commanded thousands of fighters represented ideological catastrophe as much as military problem. Initial responses varied by service and seniority. Luftwaffe officers demanded independent verification, refused to believe Allied intelligence would waste training resources on female operatives for command roles. SS commanders, more pragmatic about partisan warfare, focused on tactical implications while privately expressing shock that their extensive security apparatus had misidentified the threat for over a year. Wehrmacht Security Division officers grappled with operational reality that their counterinsurgency doctrine, designed to identify and destroy male partisan leadership, had been systematically blind to Wake's coordination model. The propaganda implications were immediately apparent. How could German forces explain to soldiers that the resistance causing such operational disruption was led by a woman when Nazi ideology explicitly positioned women as unsuited for military leadership? How could they acknowledge this to the German public without undermining fundamental claims about natural capabilities and proper social order? Official policy emerged quickly. Directive 6847, issued June 19, 1944, instructed all units operating in affected regions to reference resistance activity in reports using standard terminology without specific identification of leadership characteristics that might impact morale. The order never explicitly mentioned gender, but every officer understood its purpose. Don't tell the soldiers they're being beaten by a woman. Frontline reaction proved more complex than High Command anticipated. Soldiers who'd experienced Wake's network's attacks directly showed less concern with gender than with effectiveness. Infantry units that had lost men to ambushes, coordinated by her network, focused on tactical respect rather than ideological discomfort. They began calling resistance forces in the region Helene's Devils, with the same grudging acknowledgement they afforded any dangerous opponent. Some units requested specific intelligence about her network's operational patterns, treating her as they would any competent enemy commander. Others refused to acknowledge her role explicitly, referring in reports to bandit coordination or terrorist leadership without attributing operations to individual command. The psychological impact manifested differently across ranks. Junior officers who'd lost men to operations. Wake Coordinated wanted tactical information to counter her methods. Senior officers struggled with cognitive dissonance between doctrine that said women couldn't lead military operations and operational reports proving one absolutely could. Several Gestapo commanders privately requested transfer to other regions, rather than continue pursuing a target whose success made their years of failure increasingly humiliating. One captured internal memo, dated June 24th, expressed the frustration plainly. 4 years of intelligence operations, 5 million franc bounty, thousands of man-hours investigating, hundreds of arrests of suspected associates. Result? Target not only evades capture, but expands operations to division strength coordination. Recommend complete reassessment of operational assumptions regarding this subject. While German command struggled with implications of the discovery, Nancy Wake continued her operations without pause or acknowledgement of their discomfort. On June 11th, the day Wehrmacht intelligence began verifying her role as network coordinator, she was planning a multi-cell operation targeting German communication infrastructure across a 70-kilometer front. On June 15th, when Directive 6847 was being drafted in Lyon, she was coordinating attacks on 3 separate supply convoys simultaneously. On June 20th, as senior officers debated how to counter her network, she was recruiting additional fighters and expanding her coordination to cells she hadn't previously controlled directly. By the end of June, her network numbered approximately 6,800 fighters, approaching the peak strength of 7,000 that would make her the most effective resistance coordinator the Allies deployed in France. Her mission count during this period of German revelation included some of her most successful operations. The raid on Gestapo headquarters at Montluçon, where she'd killed the SS Sentry with her bare hands, occurred during this exact period, demonstrating that German awareness of her identity changed nothing about her operational effectiveness. She later reflected that learning Germans had confirmed her role gave her mild satisfaction, but no particular concern. "They knew who I was from the beginning," she said after the war. The bounty proved that. Whether they understood what I was doing made no difference to our bombs. The discovery changed nothing operationally. Wake's network continued attacking German targets, and Germans continued dying. After the war, Allied and Soviet interrogators collecting testimonies from German prisoners of war began documenting Eastern Front experiences systematically. When interrogators asked about resistance operations in France, a pattern emerged in responses that suggested the German military's understanding of partisan warfare had been fundamentally incomplete. Hundreds of Wehrmacht, SS, and Gestapo personnel interviewed between 1945 and 1947 described resistance operations that contradicted official German assessments about partisan capabilities and effectiveness. When specifically asked about leadership and coordination, many prisoners mentioned operations that showed sophistication beyond what German intelligence had credited to resistance networks. Several prisoners, when questioned about specific regions, referenced Auvergne operations with visible discomfort. The most striking testimonies came from officers who'd commanded security forces in areas where Wake's network operated. Hauptmann Werner Schulz, captured at Nuremberg and interrogated April 1946, commanded Wehrmacht security company responsible for protecting supply routes through Auvergne during May and June 1944. His testimony, recorded verbatim by American interrogators. We understood resistance as scattered groups of amateurs conducting isolated attacks. Our doctrine prepared us for that model. What we encountered was coordinated military operations planned with precision we would expect from regular army officers. On June 3rd, we experienced simultaneous attacks on 7 different positions across 90 kilometers. Coordination required communications, planning, and command structure we didn't believe resistance networks possessed. After capture, I learned these operations were directed by one individual, a woman, commanding thousands of fighters. This information was withheld from us during combat operations. Had we known, perhaps we would have approached the threat differently, though knowing changes nothing about effectiveness. The attack succeeded regardless of commander's gender. Our assumptions about resistance capabilities were completely wrong. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, Gestapo investigator assigned to counter-resistance operations in Lyon region, provided testimony that revealed the intelligence failure's scope. I spent 18 months attempting to identify resistance leadership structure in Auvergne. We assumed hierarchical organization similar to military command, with cell leaders reporting to regional coordinators reporting to Allied handlers. We infiltrated cells, captured fighters, conducted interrogations. The information we extracted never connected to broader networks the way our models predicted. Prisoners knew their immediate commanders, but couldn't identify regional leadership. We interpreted this as successful compartmentalization, but missed the actual structure. One coordinator operated through personal relationships rather than formal hierarchy. After war, I learned the coordinator was Nancy Wake, the white mouse we'd pursued since 1940. She commanded 7,000 fighters at peak strength. This exceeded the forces available to most Wehrmacht regimental commanders. We were searching for organization that matched our assumptions, while the actual organization operated on completely different model. The failure was systematic and total. The pattern across testimonies was remarkably consistent. German personnel described operations showing coordination and effectiveness that contradicted their understanding of partisan capabilities. Many mentioned the psychological impact of facing enemy they couldn't categorize according to familiar frameworks. Several referenced specific incidents that, when cross-referenced with Allied records, corresponded to Wake's network's operations. The testimonies revealed that German counterinsurgency doctrines' fundamental assumptions about resistance organization had blinded security forces to operational reality. They'd searched for the kind of threat they expected, rather than identifying the threat that actually existed. Oberst Friedrich Hartmann, regional SD commander for Vichy France during 1944, provided the most detailed testimony about Wake specifically. Intelligence reports referenced coordinated resistance activity we attributed to multiple separate networks. The scale of operations suggested several hundred fighters operating independently across the region. When we captured the documents in June, identifying approximately 7,000 fighters under single coordination, I personally reviewed the assessment and concluded the figure was propaganda or deliberate disinformation. No individual could command forces of that scale in resistance context, and certainly not a woman. This conclusion was professional assessment based on years of counterinsurgency experience. It was completely wrong. After Germany's surrender, I reviewed Allied records with my interrogators. Nancy Wake coordinated exactly what the captured documents claimed. Her network's operations had cost my security forces hundreds of casualties and destroyed materiel worth millions of Reichsmarks. The attacks I'd attributed to separate groups were actually coordinated operations planned by one person. Most humbling was realizing we'd been chasing her since 1940. 5 million franc bounty, thousands of investigator hours, extensive surveillance operations. She evaded everything, then returned to France and built the most effective resistance network we faced in southern France. When I learned she'd killed an SS Sentry with her bare hands during the Montluçon raid, I understood we'd underestimated not just her capabilities, but our entire framework for understanding this type of warfare. Gender was irrelevant. Competence was everything, and she was lethally competent. The testimonies confirmed what Germans had discovered too late. Nancy Wake wasn't anomaly or propaganda invention. She was among the most effective tactical coordinators deployed by the Allies in occupied France. And her network of 7,000 fighters represented one of the war's most successful resistance operations. When Allied forces liberated France in August 1944, and the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, Nancy Wake's final operational record stood as testament to what German intelligence had dismissed as impossible when they first identified her as a courier in 1940. The woman the Gestapo had nicknamed the White Mouse and valued at 5 million francs, the highest bounty placed on any Allied agent in France, had transformed from individual operative into coordinator of the largest and most effective resistance network in central France. At peak operational strength in June and July 1944, her network commanded approximately 7,000 fighters distributed across the Auvergne region, more armed personnel than many Wehrmacht regiments fielded in conventional operations. This force, organized through personal relationships rather than military hierarchy, and coordinated through face-to-face meetings rather than written orders, had inflicted casualties and material damage that Wehrmacht security divisions with vastly superior resources couldn't prevent or adequately counter. Between her parachute insertion on April 30th, 1944, and the German surrender 11 months later, Wake coordinated hundreds of individual operations, including ambushes, sabotage missions, intelligence gathering, and direct assaults on German installations. The raid on Gestapo headquarters at Montluçon, where she killed an SS sentry with her bare hands using techniques learned at SOE training, destroyed not just the building and 38 German personnel, but the entire regional intelligence archive the Gestapo had compiled over 18 months. Her network's operations destroyed an estimated 80 tons of German ammunition, disabled over 200 vehicles, cut communication lines in hundreds of locations, and killed or wounded more than 800 German soldiers. The human cost of this effectiveness was profound. She endured conditions that broke many trained soldiers, operating behind enemy lines with constant risk of capture and torture, knowing the Gestapo had executed her husband for refusing to reveal her location. She survived multiple close encounters with German patrols, cycled 500 kilometers through occupied territory in 72 hours to restore communications when her radio operator's codes were compromised, and maintained operational tempo through exhaustion, injuries, and the psychological weight of commanding thousands of lives while German forces systematically hunted her. To understand the magnitude of coordinating 7,000 fighters in occupied territory, context from conventional military operations matters. Most Allied resistance networks in France commanded between 50 and 500 fighters at peak strength. The largest known Maquis concentrations before Wake's coordination rarely exceeded 1,000 armed personnel. Her network's 7,000 fighters represented force strength comparable to a Wehrmacht infantry division, except her forces operated without formal logistics chains, without regular supply lines, without official command structure, and while actively hunted by German security apparatus specifically tasked with destroying resistance networks. Wehrmacht divisional commanders had professional military staffs, established communication systems, armored support, artillery, and air cover. Wake coordinated through intermediaries, communicated through courier networks, vulnerable to interception, and relied on Allied weapons drops that occurred irregularly, depending on weather and aircraft availability. Yet her network achieved operational effectiveness that conventional military analysis would consider impossible given the resource disparity. The asymmetry extended beyond personnel numbers to operational impact. German security forces in the Auvergne region during 1944 included approximately 12,000 soldiers assigned to counterinsurgency duties, supported by Gestapo investigators, SD intelligence officers, and Wehrmacht rapid reaction battalions. This force possessed armored vehicles, artillery, aerial reconnaissance, and sophisticated intelligence networks. Wake's 7,000 fighters had hunting rifles, captured German weapons, and improvised explosives. The Germans spent an estimated 40 million Reichsmarks attempting to suppress resistance activity in her operational area during the critical months around D-Day. British SOE investment in Wake's operations totaled approximately £30,000, roughly $120,000. Cost ratio approached 300 to 1, Germans spending 300 times what the British invested to create the threat they were attempting to counter. Effectiveness comparison inverted this disparity. Wake's network inflicted more German casualties per invested dollar than perhaps any other Allied operation in France. Her forces tied down thousands of German soldiers who could have been deployed against Allied armies advancing from Normandy. Her sabotage operations disrupted German logistics at precisely the moment Wehrmacht needed maximum mobility to counter the invasion. Strategic impact extended beyond quantifiable metrics to include psychological warfare that degraded German morale and operational confidence. The broader resistance network's collective record validated the strategic gamble of deploying female agents into occupied territory over the objections of military planners who considered it wasteful of training resources. Wake's coordination enabled resistance cells that had operated independently to combine efforts, share resources, and execute operations beyond individual groups' capabilities. Her network's actions during the 6 weeks following D-Day prevented German security forces from deploying reinforcements to Normandy, sabotaged communication systems that could have coordinated Wehrmacht response to Allied landings, and created sufficient operational chaos in German rear areas that security divisions focused on suppressing partisans rather than reinforcing defensive positions against conventional Allied advances. The cost-benefit analysis became even more striking when comparing resource expenditure to strategic value delivered. German forces allocated hundreds of personnel, dozens of vehicles, and enormous quantities of ammunition to counter resistance activity that cost the Allies minimal investment to create. Every German soldier assigned to hunting partisans was a soldier unavailable for frontline combat against Allied armies. Every ton of ammunition fired at resistance fighters was ammunition unavailable for conventional military operations. Every hour Wehrmacht officers spent planning counterinsurgency sweeps was an hour not spent preparing defenses against Allied advances. Wake's network represented asymmetric warfare at its most effective, minimal Allied investment, producing maximum German resource drain at precisely the moment Germany needed those resources most desperately. Resistance coordination didn't win the war, but it made German defensive operations measurably less effective, and Allied offensive operations measurably more successful. And the woman coordinating 7,000 fighters had achieved this impact while German intelligence was still attempting to determine whether the White Mouse was one person or several operatives using the same codename. After the war ended, Nancy Wake faced challenges that military training hadn't prepared her for. Initial recognition came swiftly. France awarded her the Médaille de la Résistance and made her Chevalier of the Legion of Honor, later promoting her to officer. The United States presented her with the Medal of Freedom. Britain awarded her the George Medal. These honors acknowledged her extraordinary service, but they couldn't address the psychological toll of returning to civilian life after years of constant danger, where every decision affected whether people lived or died. She'd lost her husband to Gestapo torture, lost friends and comrades to German bullets, and survived experiences that would haunt her for decades. She attempted various careers after the war, working for British intelligence briefly, trying civilian jobs that felt meaningless compared to the intensity of resistance operations. She married twice more, both marriages ending in divorce, perhaps because no peacetime relationship could match the bonds forged in wartime. She moved between countries, Australia to Britain to France, and back, searching for belonging in a world that had moved on while she remained anchored to 1944. When Australia finally offered to award her medals in the 1980s, 6 decades after she'd risked her life while other Australians were being decorated, she famously told the government they could keep their belated recognition. She eventually settled in Britain, living in relative obscurity, despite being one of the most decorated women of World War II. French authorities scattered her ashes near Montluçon in 2013, 2 years after her death at age 98, honoring her request to rest in the region where her network of 7,000 fighters had made their greatest stand against German occupation. For decades, the full scope of Wake's achievements remained incompletely understood in the West. Cold War dynamics meant Soviet resistance stories were dismissed as propaganda, while Western accounts focused on American and British conventional military operations. Intelligence agencies that had employed agents like Wake were reluctant to declassify operational details that might reveal sources and methods still considered sensitive. Wake herself, like many SOE veterans, was bound by Official Secrets Act provisions that prevented her from discussing certain operations. The story emerged gradually as archives opened, as surviving resistance fighters published memoirs, as historians gained access to German records that validated Allied accounts. Books in the 1980s and 1990s began documenting the extraordinary scope of SOE operations and the women who'd served as agents. Wake's story appeared in biographies and historical accounts, though often her role was minimized or her network's size underestimated because the scale seemed implausible. German testimonies collected during post-war interrogations proved crucial for validating claims that skeptical historians had questioned. When German officers confirmed they'd faced coordinated resistance operations led by a woman commanding thousands of fighters, when Gestapo records showed the 5 million franc bounty and the years of failed attempts to capture her, when Wehrmacht casualty reports documented losses to operations her network had conducted, the historical record became undeniable. Modern recognition has been more comprehensive. Museums feature exhibits about SOE agents and French resistance operations, where Wake's contributions are prominently displayed. Historians acknowledge her as one of the most effective Allied operatives in occupied France. Films and documentaries have brought her story to audiences who knew nothing of the woman who'd been the Gestapo's most wanted person. The story of Nancy Wake and the resistance network she commanded transcends its historical moment to reveal enduring principles about warfare, underestimation, and human capability. About warfare, Her operations demonstrated that asymmetric tactics, leveraging enemy vulnerabilities, can defeat technological and numerical superiority. The Germans possessed overwhelming advantages in personnel, equipment, intelligence infrastructure, and military experience. Yet Wake's network achieved strategic impact, disproportionate to the resources invested in creating it. Psychological effects sometimes exceeded physical damage, as German forces degraded by constant harassment and inability to counter threats they couldn't adequately identify or eliminate. Innovation mattered more than resources. Wake's decentralized coordination model, her exploitation of German assumptions about women's military capabilities, and her network's adaptation to operational constraints proved more effective than German security apparatus built on decades of counterinsurgency experience. About underestimation, the Germans' initial dismissal of female operatives as desperate Allied improvisation created systematic blindness that Wake exploited ruthlessly. Their assumptions about appropriate gender roles and military capability made them literally unable to see the threat she represented, even as evidence accumulated. Prejudice created vulnerabilities, as checkpoint procedures designed to detect male partisans allowed Wake to pass through repeatedly. The enemy's perceived weakness became their strength, as German forces searched for conventional military organization, while Wake commanded through relationships that left no paper trail to follow. About determination, coordinating 7,000 fighters while the Gestapo actively hunted her required extraordinary resilience that quantitative analysis cannot capture. Every operation could end in capture and torture. Every decision affected whether resistance fighters lived or died. The physical and psychological toll of operating under that pressure for years would have broken most people. Survival required skill, certainly, but also luck and absolute refusal to quit when quitting would have been rational response to overwhelming danger. The German officer who dismissed resistance activity as amateur bandit operations never understood what Nancy Wake proved across years of operations, coordinating 7,000 fighters against occupation forces that should have crushed her network through sheer resource advantage. Courage doesn't require the best equipment, as her fighters demonstrated with captured weapons against German divisions. Skill can overcome raw power, as her tactics, exploiting German assumptions, achieved impact far beyond her network's numerical strength. And determination makes seemingly impossible achievements real, as her survival and success against 5 million franc bounty and years of Gestapo pursuit proved definitively. Her coordination of 7,000 fighters wasn't just a statistical achievement. It was proof that the Germans calculated everything except the variable that mattered most: the will to resist. And in occupied France, where German security apparatus should have prevented large-scale resistance organization, where female operatives were dismissed as incapable of military leadership, where every advantage favored the occupiers, Nancy Wake and thousands of fighters who trusted her coordination prove that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the most powerful one. It's the one your enemy refuses to take seriously until far too late.